Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today we're going to talk about belt grinders, specifically about the sequence of belts that you go through when you're making a knife. So I've got a number of videos already that I talk about specific elements of belt grinder technique, how to do plunge lines and stuff like that. But what I wanted to talk about today is the actual sequence of belts that you go through. Now, it might seem, if you've been doing this for a little while, like that's kind of a stupid subject because, basically you're going to start with a heavy grit and work your way up to finer and finer grits. If that's news to you, then you probably just started this, and that alone is a valuable thing to know. But there actually is a lot of complexity to it depending on what it is that you're trying to achieve. So I'm going to try and talk about some of the different alternatives that you might take, why you might choose one belt over another as you're working your way through that sequence of belts from low grits to high grits. All right, now before I get started with the minutiae, let me kind of back up a little bit and just talk for real beginners in this area about some of the just basic aspects of belts. Other than the basic size of a belt, there are three main attributes that belts are going to have. The first is the type of abrasive that's on the belt. These could be ceramic, zirconia, aluminum oxide, and then there are some other ones that typically aren't used by knife makers, at least not for making knives, silicon carbide, garnet, and some other things. So the second element is grit size. You start with heavy grit that is going to be used for roughing out your shape. And then as you move up to finer and finer grits, you start to refine the shape of your knife. So a third element is the type of backing that the belt has. Belts are, basically a backing material, which is typically some kind of cloth, but sometimes plastic. And then there's the abrasive is, basically bonded onto that. So wide variety of different types of backs. Some are harder, some are softer, and those play into how they react with whatever work you're grinding. All right, so let me lead you just through kind of a typical sequence that would be used just for roughing out any old knife. The first grit that you're going to use is specifically for what we call roughing or hogging out the knife. Typically, that's going to be 36 or 40 grit. Some people use 60. If you're a beginner, there's a good argument to be made for starting with 60 rather than the really heavy grits. Those go really fast, and I guess what you might say is they amplify your mistakes. So if you really go crazy with a heavy grit belt, then there's a likelihood of you kind of screwing up the whole knife and having to start over. So typically I'm going to just do all of that basic shaping of the knife with the 40 or 36 grit ceramic belt. Aluminum oxide belts typically are not made in those really heavy grits, but putting that aside, ceramic belts last way longer than aluminum oxide. The most demanding thing that you're going to do with a belt grinder is roughing out the knife itself. And so you want to start with that real heavy grit and just get as much material off there as you can. Next in the sequence is typically going to be 60 grit. For 60 grit, what I'm trying to do is sort of refine my lines. The thing about the really heavy grit belts, the 40 and 60 grit belts, is that they take off so much material so fast that they're not necessarily super accurate. So I'll turn to that 60 grit belt. Typically, again, I'm going to be using ceramic, but sometimes I'll use aluminum oxide too. Aluminum oxide is a lot cheaper, ceramic lasts longer, so you're always balancing those two things. What I'm trying to do with the 60 grit is kind of refine my lines a little bit. Just get, it's pretty typical that when you're grinding, you're going to run into some little inconsistencies or something. Easier to clean those up with 60 grit than with the roughing belt, 36 or 40. Let me jump in here to mention that today's video is sponsored by Combat Abrasives. They're a family-owned American manufacturer offering a wide selection of belts. Now, I've used many of their belts, including ceramic, aluminum oxide, and zirconium. The prices are good, and their focus is specifically on the knife making community. Their basic aluminum oxide belts come in at a good price point and last a lot longer than some of the inexpensive belts that I've used in the past. Another thing that I've really been excited about is their ceramic belts for roughing in the 40, 60, and 120 grit range. Their performance is very competitive with the big manufacturers at about half the price. So check out their online shop by clicking the link in the description. So next belt I typically go to is going to be a 120. Again, I might go to ceramic, might go to aluminum oxide, and actually a third possibility is zirconia. I really like zirconia belts. I find that they cut. This is a sort of subtle thing, I guess, but I like the way that they cut in those middle ranges better than the ceramics. To me, the ceramics, it's sort of hard to express, but to me they're sort of blurry. In other words, they don't, they're not so great for fine work. So sometimes I'll turn to the zirconia or aluminum oxide belts once I get to that 120 grit range. What I'm trying to do there is really get my lines nice and crisp. The plunge lines, the grind lines, I want those to start not only being accurate, meaning that they just travel in the right direction and with the right shape, but that they also start to look nice and crisp. Of course, the single most important thing that you're doing as you work your way up through these sequences of belts is you always want to get rid of the initial scratches from whatever previous belt that you've used as you're moving up to those higher belts. If you leave scratches, let's just say for instance you started at 60, if you rough it out at 60 and then you move to 120 and you don't get all of those 60 grit scratches, you might go up to 220, then 320 or wherever it is that you might end, and then start rubbing it by hand and doing all kinds of fancy hand sanding and find that you've still got 60 grit scratches back there. It looks awful and they're really hard to get out. So you always want to make sure as you're moving up through that sequence of belts that you get all the scratches of the previous abrasive out. So after 120 you're going to move up to 220. Again, your lines are going to start to get more crisp, and at that point you may even be going for a final surface. It depends on what your goal is. But you know, if you're trying to make just a kind of workaday chef's knife or some utility knife, 220 may be as far as you want to go, and that's it. If that's not the case, if you're going to be moving on to more complex things, and we're going to talk about some of the end points of different grinding strategies, you might want to move on to 320 or 400. So once you get past that kind of 320, 400 grit, typically, at least in my case, I would be moving on to some kind of specialty belt. And there are a whole bunch of different kinds of specialty belts that are used in sort of different types of finishing operations. They might include cork, surface conditioning belts. And then finally, you've also got structured abrasives, and there are a number of different kinds of those, gator grit from 3M and a whole bunch of other similar kinds of things from some other manufacturers. All right, so let's stop talking here and I'll go ahead and do some grinding. Incidentally, normally I'd be using slightly different eye protection. I'd be using a respirator and all that sort of safety equipment, but because I'm going to be stopping to talk all the time, I don't want to take all that gear off, and so for you guys, I am throwing myself on the sword here. All right, so what I'm going to demonstrate first here is using a slightly chewed up belt to establish a little bevel along the edge. This is just to get the thing started, and typically when we do that we're going to use a pretty chewed up old belt. So that's what I've got right here. A lot of knife makers like establishing this little edge here. The basic idea here is we're just trying to save ourselves some belt wear, so we don't want to use a really nice fresh belt right up on that edge and then grind all the fresh abrasive off of it. So now I'm switching over to a nice brand new belt. You can see how much shinier and brighter colored it is. And what I'll do now is grind in a roughed out bevel. So what I've done here is basically just laid in my bevel. I've got a grind line established, I've got a plunge line established, and I've got a consistent flat bevel that runs from one end to the other in a very consistent way. Now, it's pretty typical to have some minor inconsistencies here. You might dig up a little higher here, or you might go a little too far here. These belts are quite aggressive. This 40 grit and 36 grit ceramics are quite aggressive, and so it's just pretty easy to go a little too far in one place or whatever. And so typically, you know, the 60 is where I want to start cleaning this up. Now this looks pretty good, but you know, maybe I'm off a little bit, so my 60 is going to be the one where I'm just going to try and kind of clean everything up. So just for the sake of variety, I'm going to be using an aluminum oxide belt here. Like I said, at this point, you know, it's kind of a toss-up for me whether I want to go with a ceramic or an aluminum oxide. I feel like aluminum oxide gives me a little bit more control. Ceramic cuts faster and lasts longer. So it's really kind of a question of which one, you know, makes more sense for, you know, the kind of knives that you're making, and maybe how many you're making, whether you're just doing this as a hobby, whether you're trying to sell some, whether you're in a rush, that sort of thing. All right, let's roll here. So there, in a couple of passes, I've now got my line, you know, pretty crisp up here, pretty even, and I've gotten rid of all of the 40 grit scratches on here. So in this case, my lines are nice and clean. I feel pretty good about everything, so maybe I'm just going to move real quickly and I'm going to show off a 120 ceramic belt again. So a quick little note, as you grind, you're always going to be sticking it in the bucket, and it almost immediately rusts just a little bit, and that'll help you see where those scratches still are. that you might need to be getting rid of. So right in here we can see in one pass basically I got rid of all the previous scratches, but I've got just this one little area where there's still a little bit that you can see of this rust here, and so I'm going to get rid of those in one more pass, and then I'll move on to 220. So as you can see, I'm not dwelling here either. All my lines look pretty good, and so I'm just going to cruise right through here, get rid of all the previous scratches, move on to 220. So as you can see, the grind line there is going to be just a little more crisp with each successive grit. So as you'll see here, this is an aluminum oxide belt. Again, the browns are the aluminum oxides. The ceramics are going to be all kinds of bright colors, reds and yellows, depending on the manufacturer. Combat Abrasives that sponsors this particular video, theirs happen to be red, but sometimes you'll see other colors too. So now all these brown ones are going to be the aluminum oxides, and at this point I'm going to start worrying about rolling this little plunge line, evening everything up, and of course getting rid of the previous scratches. So right in here, at this point it starts to become important what kind of weight of belt we're using here. This one is an X weight. Basically, the numbers go, typically you see J weight, which is very flexible, and then X weight, which is medium, and then Y weight, and there's some other subtleties to it. But if you're trying to have a really crisp plunge line, you want a little bit harder belt. If you want a really soft rolled line, then you need softer belts. In this case, I've got a pretty crisp little line here, and so this X weight is going to be just about right for this particular application. So at this point I really want to get everything right. You know, I want to make sure that the grind line is correct. In other words, that it doesn't rise up too high here or shear off in the wrong place or have wobbles and dips in it. As I move it this way, you can see that I've got a really flat, clean surface. I want to get all of that correct at this point. If it's not fixed here at 220, it's never going to get fixed. So everything's got to be, you know, basically my goal with the 220 is to just get everything dead nuts and get it right. Well, so I thought this was going to be a really simple, quick video, but it turned out we took a pretty deep dive into this subject. First half of this, we've just kind of run through the sequence of grits as we move up from roughing to finishing. The second half of this video is going to be essentially the finishing process itself. This is where you really get into a lot of different options depending on what it is that you're trying to do. All right, let's break it off and we'll take things up in the next video. Thanks for watching, guys. If you feel like you got something out of this video, don't forget to subscribe. Also, click on the link to Patreon for a great way to give back to the channel. Plus, check me out on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Links in the description. If you want something sharp and pointy, maybe a gift for yourself or one of the cooler people in your life, check out my Tactics Armory website and pick up one of our tactical or outdoor knives. And finally, if you want to learn to make hamones or Japanese swords, check out WalterSorrellsBlades.com, where you can find videos about how I make hamones, as well as forging, mounting, polishing, and fittings for Japanese swords. Thanks, and see you soon.